It's October 1274. You're a samurai standing on the beach at Hakata Bay watching the horizon. And the horizon is full of ships. Not 10, not 100. More than 900 vessels emerging from the morning mist, stretching as far as you can see in both directions. The largest invasion fleet ever assembled in East Asian history. 30,000 soldiers on those ships. Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, Korean conscripts, all of them trained by the military machine that had already conquered most of the known world: Persia, Russia, Poland, China, Korea. An unstoppable force that had never lost a campaign in living memory. You have about 10,000 men, and you're about to discover that everything you know about how to fight a war is catastrophically wrong. This is the story of what a samurai versus Mongol battle actually looked like, and it is one of the most extraordinary collisions in military history, not just because of who won, but because of how. And because one man was angry enough about not getting proper credit that he commissioned a set of paintings to make sure everyone remembered exactly what happened. We'll get to him. First, let's set the stage. By the mid-13th century, the samurai class had been the military backbone of Japan for nearly 100 years. The word samurai itself comes from the verb saburao, to serve. And these were warriors who served noble lords, bound by a code of conduct that would eventually crystallize into what we call Bushido. In 1274, that code was not yet the highly formalized system it would later become, but the underlying ethos was already deeply embedded in how samurai thought about war. War, to a samurai of this era, was not simply the business of killing. It was theater. It was performance. It was an opportunity to demonstrate personal honor in a way that could be recorded, remembered, and rewarded. Before major battles, it was common practice for a warrior to ride out in front of the armies, announce his name, his lineage, his previous deeds in battle, and challenge a worthy opponent to step forward and face him in single combat. The armies would watch. The duel would happen. Then the next man would step forward. Combat was sequential, honorable, documented. A samurai warrior's primary weapons were the bow, shot from horseback at full gallop, and the katana, a curved, single-edged blade that represented, spiritually and practically, the soul of its owner. The armor a samurai wore was a masterpiece of engineering in its own right: laminated, lacquered plates laced together with silk cord into a flexible, beautiful, expensive suit that could deflect arrows and absorb sword strikes while allowing enough mobility to fight on horseback. A fully equipped samurai in 1274 was one of the most formidable individual fighting units on the planet. The key word is individual. Now let's talk about who they were about to meet. The Mongol military machine under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Yuan dynasty, was the most sophisticated combined arms force in the world. The Mongols had spent a century developing a style of warfare that was built entirely around speed, coordination, and psychological devastation. They used flags and drums to coordinate movements across the entire battlefield simultaneously. Their cavalry used a feigned retreat, pulling back under pressure to draw the enemy out of position, then wheeling and cutting them down from the multiple angles. They had Chinese engineers who built siege weapons. They had Korean sailors who built and crewed their ships. They had poison-tipped arrows and, crucially, something Japan had never seen before: the tetsuhao. The tetsuhao was a ceramic or iron shell packed with gunpowder, shrapnel, and sometimes poison. A hand-thrown grenade, essentially, 500 years before the concept appeared in European warfare. When it detonated, the explosion alone wasn't necessarily lethal, but the noise, the concussive pressure, the flying shards, and most crucially, the effect on horses made it one of the most psychologically effective weapons ever deployed. Japanese war horses, trained for the specific cadence of Japanese battle, had never encountered gunpowder explosions. When the first Tetsuhou detonated on the beaches of Hakata Bay, they went insane. The invasion force had been assembled after years of escalating tension. Kublai Khan had sent diplomatic missions to Japan no fewer than 6 times between 1266 and 1273, demanding submission. The Japanese response was silence, and then more silence, and then the last envoy was sent back without an audience. The shogunate, the military government running Japan under the Hojo regent in Kamakura, recognized the threat was coming, but their preparations were inadequate for what actually arrived. The Mongols hit the outlying islands first. On the island of Tsushima, midway between Korea and Japan, the local commander, So Sukekuni, rallied whatever forces he could, approximately 80 mounted samurai, 80 men against an advance force of thousands. By any military logic, this was an impossible fight that should have ended in 30 seconds. Instead, the samurai archers on horseback cut down scores of Mongol soldiers before they were overwhelmed. Suicidal, magnificent, and completely futile. But the Mongols remembered it. They had expected to brush aside whatever defense Japan had to offer. Those 80 samurai on Tsushima were the first warning that this island was going to be different. The Mongols sacked Tsushima anyway, then moved to the island of Iki, where the same pattern played out. Outnumbered defenders, fierce resistance, eventually overrun. But here, the Mongols did something that the Japanese on the mainland would witness and remember with fury. They captured Japanese civilians. Women punched holes through their hands, threaded rope between them, and hung them as human shields across the bows of their ships. A psychological weapon as calculated as the Tetsuhou, designed to tell the defenders exactly what kind of enemy was coming. On November 18th, 1274, the fleet entered Hakata Bay. The Japanese forces on the shore were outnumbered roughly 3-1 and disorganized. The shogunate had not had enough time to coordinate a proper defense from across the whole of Kyushu, let alone Japan. The samurai commanders present made the decision to hold the beach and meet the invasion head-on. And then the samurai did what they had always done. A warrior rode out. He raised his bow above his head, the traditional signal of challenge. He announced his name and his bloodline and his deeds in battle and called for a worthy opponent to step forward. The Mongols shot him. Not in single combat, not after a ritual exchange, a volley of arrows from the massed ranks of Mongol archers who had greater range than Japanese bows and were operating as coordinated units, not as individuals, simply cut him down before he finished the sentence. For the samurai watching from the shore, this wasn't just tactically disorienting, it was cosmically wrong. The rules of war weren't being broken. The enemy apparently didn't know the rules existed. What followed was a masterclass in military mismatch. The Mongol forces advanced in tight formations, shields overlapping, using drums and flags to execute precise, coordinated maneuvers. As Japanese cavalry charged toward them to engage in the individual combat that was the samurai's entire frame of reference, the Mongol archers opened up with volleys of arrows on a timed rotation. One rank shooting, stepping back to reload, the next rank stepping forward and shooting, so that the arrow fire was essentially continuous. The arrows were shorter than Japanese war arrows and fired from composite bows made of layered wood, horn and sinew that had longer range than anything the Japanese were carrying. Some were tipped with poison. A glancing hit that would normally do minimal damage became fatal within hours. When the Japanese got close enough for hand-to-hand combat, the Tetsuhou started landing. The explosions, the sound, the pressure, the shrapnel scattered the horses, broke the formations, turned coordinated cavalry charges into chaos. Then the Mongols did something the samurai genuinely didn't have a tactical answer for: coordinated infantry with spears, fighting in tight blocks, presenting a wall of points to mounted samurai who were trying to find individual opponents to duel. One eyewitness to all of this was a low-ranking samurai named Takazaki Suenaga, 28 years old, who had ridden to Hakata Bay ahead of his assigned unit out of sheer impatience to fight. He charged into a group of Mongol soldiers with 4 companions. His horse was killed. His companions were killed or scattered. He was surrounded and almost certainly about to die when a senior samurai commander named Shiraishi Michiyasu happened to charge through the same position and pulled him out. Suenaga survived, and what happened next tells you everything you need to know about samurai culture in this era, because Suenaga's immediate concern, even in the middle of the most dangerous day Japan had ever seen, was whether there had been a reliable witness to confirm his bravery. Because without a witness, there was no reward. Without a reward, the whole thing was just a near-death experience with no career benefit. He found his witness, he got his testimony, and nearly 20 years later he commissioned a set of illustrated scrolls, the Moko Shirai Ekotoba, the illustrated account of the Mongol invasion, specifically to document his personal bravery for posterity and push his claim for additional rewards. Those scrolls, painted in the 1290s by artists working from Suenaga's own descriptions, survive today in the Museum of the Imperial Collections at the Tokyo Imperial Palace. They are the closest thing to contemporary battlefield photography the medieval world produced, and they show Suenaga being blown off his horse by explosions, surrounded by Mongols, rescued at the last second. An impetuous, glory-hungry, slightly reckless minor samurai who happened to be standing at one of the hinge points of history. Back on the beach at Hakata Bay, the Japanese defenders were taking massive casualties and being pushed back off the shoreline into the nearby town of Hakata. The Mongols burned it. The fighting continued into the night, the samurai falling back toward the fortified position at Dazaifu several miles inland, battered, losing, unable to answer the Mongols' tactical playbook with anything that worked. Then something odd happened. The Mongols stopped. They pulled back to their ships. Why remains one of the enduring historical debates about the 1274 invasion. The standard Japanese narrative, reinforced for centuries, was that a storm rose in the night and damaged the fleet, forcing the retreat. There's archaeological evidence of storm damage to some ships, but there are also reports of internal disagreement among the Mongol commanders, shortages of arrows after a day of continuous volley fire, and the possibility that the force, which had taken more casualties than expected from those furious, suicidal Japanese counterattacks, simply decided to regroup before committing to a full inland advance. The history of Yuan records that a great storm arose, and many warships were dashed on the rocks. Of the 30,000-strong invasion force, 13,500 did not return to Korea. Japan had survived, barely, and through a combination of its own desperate fighting and whatever happened on that stormy night, the greatest military machine in the world had sailed away. The Kamakura shogunate spent the next 7 years preparing for round 2. They were absolutely certain it was coming. Japanese commanders had watched the 1274 battle closely enough to understand several things. The beach was the worst possible place to fight. The Mongols' composite bows outranged theirs. The Tetsuhao required a tactical answer, and fighting as individuals against coordinated formations was a death sentence. What Japan needed was a way to negate the Mongols' ability to land, bring their formations to bear, and use their artillery on open ground, so they built a wall. In 1276, construction began on what historians call the Genko Barui, the Mongol invasion wall, a stone barrier 2 meters high and 20 kilometers long running the entire length of Hakata Bay's coastline, built in the span of 6 months, using forced labor from samurai estates across northern Kyushu. The wall served a specific tactical purpose. If the Mongols couldn't land and form up their tight, coordinated formations on open beach, those formations lost most of their advantage. The Tetsuhou were designed for use against cavalry in open field. Against soldiers fighting behind a stone wall, they were far less effective. Japan also built ships, smaller, more maneuverable than the heavy Mongol transport vessels, and samurai with entirely new ideas about how to use them. When the second invasion came in 1281, and it was enormous, somewhere between 140,000 and 150,000 troops on over 4,000 ships, the largest seaborne invasion force in history up to that point, it ran straight into a Japan that was ready. The Eastern Route Army arrived at Hakata Bay first in June and immediately discovered the wall. The Mongols tried to land and establish a beachhead. The samurai, fighting from behind the stone barrier, held them. Again and again, the Mongols attempted to force a landing. Again and again, the wall held. Ships that drew close enough for Tetsuhou to be thrown onto the beach came into range of Japanese archers who had spent 7 years practicing on moving targets. And then the Japanese did something that nobody was expecting. They took the fight to the ships. Small Japanese boats, fast and shallow drafted, moved out to the anchored Mongol fleet at night. Samurai climbed the hulls in the darkness, fought through the deck crews in brutal close-quarters combat where the tight formations that made the Mongol infantry so formidable on an open field were useless in the narrow spaces of a ship deck, and then set the ships on fire before escaping back into the dark. Night raid after night raid, week after week, the Japanese harassed the fleet and kept the Mongols from ever fully establishing themselves on shore. The Southern Route Army, a larger force, carrying 100,000 troops, which had been delayed, finally arrived from southern China in mid-August. The combined fleet anchored off Takashima Island, cramped together, crews exhausted, still unable to force a landing at Hakata Bay. And then, on August 14th, 1281, a typhoon struck. Not a squall, a full typhoon, the kind that forms in the western Pacific in late summer and turns the sea into a wall of wind and water. The Mongol commanders had made a decision that would prove catastrophic. To protect against the Japanese night raids, they had lashed their ships together in groups to make them harder to board. Against a typhoon, this was a death sentence. A single ship can ride enormous waves by moving with them. Ships lashed together cannot. They were driven against each other, against rocks, against the shore. The wind scattered what the waves didn't sink. By the time it was over, somewhere between a third and half the fleet had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of soldiers drowned. The survivors who made it to shore were hunted down by Japanese samurai in the days that followed. The remnants of the invasion force were either killed or taken prisoner. Of the 150,000 who had sailed from Korea and China, fewer than half returned home. The Japanese called the typhoon kamikaze, divine wind. The idea that the gods themselves had intervened to save Japan from the greatest military force on earth became one of the central myths of Japanese identity, and would echo 7 centuries later in the name given to a very different kind of desperate last defense. Kublai Khan planned a third invasion. He ordered the construction of enormous counterweight trebuchets, technology the Mongols had learned from Persian engineers, presumably to batter the Hakata Bay wall from a distance before landing. But the Yuan dynasty was overstretched. The cost of the 2 failed invasions had been staggering, and rebellions elsewhere in the empire kept demanding attention. The third invasion was canceled in 1286 and never rescheduled. Japan would not face a serious foreign invasion again for nearly 700 years. But here's what's fascinating about what those two battles actually changed. The samurai who fought at Hakata Bay in 1274 and 1281 didn't win by being better warriors than the Mongols. In straight individual combat terms, the Mongol forces had tactical advantages the samurai couldn't fully neutralize. What the samurai won with was adaptation. By 1281, they had studied what happened in 1274 and answered it. A wall for the coordinated formations, ships for the naval superiority, night raids for the psychological advantage, and enough individual ferocity to make every attempted landing brutally costly. The man who captures this best is still Takazaki Suinaga, riding ahead of his unit, charging into a group of Mongols, getting his horse shot out from under him, nearly dying, and then immediately worrying about whether anyone important saw him do it. He represents the essential tension at the heart of the samurai world colliding with the Mongol world. A system built around individual honor, meeting a system built around collective efficiency. The system built around individual honor lost almost every tactical exchange, and Japan survived anyway. Those scrolls Suinaga commissioned are still in Tokyo. The wall the Japanese built at Hakata Bay still has sections standing today in Fukuoka. Underwater archaeologists diving off Takashima Island have recovered weapons, anchors, and ship timbers from the 1281 fleet. And in 2011, they found a Tetsuhou, intact, still containing its gunpowder charge after 730 years at the bottom of the sea. The battlefield is still there. The evidence is still coming up from the water. And it turns out that the most important military collision of the medieval world wasn't settled by the greatest army ever assembled or by the most formidable individual warriors in Asia. It was settled by a 2-meter stone wall, a fleet of small, fast boats, and a storm that had no idea it was making history. Subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, which warrior culture from history would you want to see us break down next?